Hey, Cypher here, and it's time to talk about the causes of yet another American war. Sure won't run out of this topic anytime soon, won't I? This time, I think it's one of the most controversial ones. The Vietnam War. Well, the causes of that one are easy. It's anti-communism. No, of course not. There's more complications. Monocausal explanations are lazy and inaccurate, especially when it comes to saying a single word.
But now, this time, it's just something that I don't understand. Why? Why Vietnam? Why Vietnam? Why Vietnam?
There is so much more to the causes of a war, and we only make such slaughter possible again by resorting to such simplistic explanations. Like all wars, the causes of the US intervention into the Vietnam War are complicated and ill-defined. There is no clear starting point. One could say that the war began with the first American death in 1945, when Viet Minh forces mistakenly shot an OSS officer after World War II had ended. Or you could say it was in 1950, when President Truman officially supported the old regime that would become South Vietnam. Then there was 1955, when Eisenhower sent in military advisors, 1962, when JFK sent Green Berets in massive numbers, or 1964, when LBJ ramped up the already established mission to full-scale warfare. The beginning of American involvement in the Vietnam War could be any of those dates and more. Even the endpoint is disputed. Was it 1971 when the US began pulling out and ended the draft? 73 when US troops were no longer present and a peace settlement had been reached? Or 75 when North Vietnam broke that treaty and conquered South Vietnam without American resistance? Yes, the length of the war could vary from 30 years to merely 7, depending on one's definition. The best metaphor I've heard for this is called the camel's nose. If you let a camel stick its nose under the tent, eventually it will insist on being completely within the tent. America is the camel here. We stuck our nose in, and bit by bit we became fully entangled. It took so much blood and treasure to dislodge ourselves again, forever changing not just American and Vietnamese history, but how the world arranges power. The camel's nose teaches us a lesson about how seemingly small involvement can escalate into overwhelming commitments, even for the most powerful nation on Earth. And that process drags everyone down with it. In the military, we called this mission creep. It's the tendency of a mission to expand in scope until somebody of authority finally puts the kibosh on it. Unfortunately, that didn't happen soon enough in Vietnam. Instead, everyone fear-mongered that the Reds would take more and more nations like a set of dominoes. If South Vietnam fell, next would be the rest of the former Indochina, then India, and so on and so forth. Each domino or nation was easily susceptible to communism and threatened world peace, at least if the United States didn't contain the spread.
President Eisenhower clearly recognizes the danger.
Unassisted, Vietnam cannot, at this time, produce and support the military formations essential to it. Military, as well as economic help, is currently needed in Vietnam.
Never mind if that was their choice, we had to halt the contagion that would supposedly destroy the world. The final domino in that sequence wasn't actually in India or anything like it. It's actually where I'm starting this story, in France. Thanks to my patrons on Patreon and MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. MyHeritage is a genealogy service which can help you research your family background. They match your known ancestry with other people's genealogies and billions of records that they have digital access to. This episode is about Vietnam, so what about veterans in my family? Besides myself, none of my aunts, uncles, parents, sister, or cousins served in the military, but 3 out of 4 of my grandparents did serve during World War II. Grandpa Bill was in the Army Air Forces, and he always said that he fought a typewriter during the war. Grandpa Pat was a Navy cook, beginning early enough to be part of the Yangtze River Patrol, and during the war he did underwater demolition. He remained in the Navy as a drill instructor afterwards. Grandma Jane was too young, but Grandma MJ was a nurse and the only officer of that generation. Through my heritage, I can dig into their extended families and see who else served as well. You can too, and build out a family tree like this one, which allows you to configure it in a bunch of ways. They help automatically find records that match your relatives and sort out your genealogical research. They can also enhance, colorize, and animate old pictures. Furthermore, you can use their archive to research individuals outside your immediate tree. After all of humanity is related in some way. So there's a lot to do with their service, and you can get a free 2-week trial with the link below. So go check out MyHeritage, and on with the show. When Napoleon III seized permanent power in 1852, he immediately sought to expand the French Empire. This included Southeast Asia. For instance, they attacked southern Vietnam in 1858, eventually conquering it by 1862. A year later, they imposed a protectorate over Cambodia. France started colonizing both areas in the late 1860s. After Napoleon III fell from power, thanks to his defeat during the Franco-Prussian War, France invaded Tonkin, as in northern Vietnam, in 1883 with a small force. China intervened to protect Tonkin, but France easily defeated them and imposed a protectorate over the rest of Vietnam. This caused a controversy in France over whether they were fighting pointless wars, which brought down the moderate Republicans there. They'd add Laos and some Siamese territory to their holdings throughout the 1890s and early 20th century, comprising a combined colony called Indochina. There would be periodic rebellions against French control, but they largely maintained an iron grip on Indochina until World War II, with the Nazi conquest of France in 1940 that allowed Japan to start entering the colony. They steadily spread throughout Vietnam. A communist named Ho Chi Minh began an insurgency against the Japanese in 1941, called the Viet Minh, which was commanded by Vo Nguyen Giap. Nonetheless, Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai declared his independence from France in 1945 and basically became a Japanese puppet. Japan used this to propagandize their co-prosperity sphere and popularize opposition to France, even as they were clearly losing the war. Anti-imperialist propaganda from an empire was, unsurprisingly, not effective. The United States and Britain sent arms and supplies to rebels, including the Viet Minh, who were eventually successful. With these munitions came secret agents under the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. French control returned as the Japanese Empire collapsed, and Bao Dai flipped to support their colonialism again. OSS officers continued to support the Viet Minh, though. They were our allies, after all, but that would rapidly deteriorate. In August, the Viet Minh took over most of the countryside, leaving French troops only in control of merely the cities. It's possible that the OSS helped draft Ho's Declaration of Independence against French colonialism in September, especially since it directly quoted the American Declaration, written by Thomas Jefferson, and the French Rights of Man, which, incidentally, was written in Jefferson's bedroom. Interestingly, Ho had attempted to meet with Woodrow Wilson back in 1919, but got ignored. So this was symbolic of the USA coming closer to Ho. With such a seemingly close relationship, how did it fall apart? Only a month later, some Viet Minh ambushed and killed OSS officer A. Peter Dewey, mistaking him for a Frenchman. That certainly didn't endear Ho's rebels to President Truman. At the same time, American support steadily withdrew throughout late 1945 and early 46, since World War II was over and France was technically an ally. British troops helped the French re-establish control during that time in the South, and then pulled out as well.
Nonetheless, the United States did not initially take a position on the burgeoning war. After all, Vietnam was simply another colony seeking independence, something Americans had particular sympathies for following the war. France and Ho Chi Minh started negotiations in 1946. Instead, a war broke out. The Viet Minh organized a government in exile while they fought French occupiers in the north. France seemed to be winning in the early years of the Indochina War, swaying Truman's favor toward the empire. Viet Minh publications and propaganda was distinctly communist, which further distanced Truman from them, given the Cold War was beginning and he was engaged in a Red Scare at home. So the United States began to officially support the French-backed Bao Dai government, which formed an official state in 1949. The following year, American aid and munitions went to France and Bao's Vietnam, just as the Korean War heated up. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency bought up an airline from Chinese nationalists who had just lost China to Mao Zedong's Communist Party. They used it to covertly support anti-communist movements throughout the Far East, including Vietnam during the First Indochina War. They helped colonialist forces fight Viet Minh insurgents, resulting in a few American casualties in the 1950s. But France and her allies were losing in the north. By 1954, Vietnamese communists besieged thousands of French forces at Dien Bien Phu for 2 months. During that time, Americans proposed Operation Vulture, where a joint operation would evacuate colonialist troops, but Britain refused and President Eisenhower wasn't willing to get too involved. It was a near miss for American involvement. France negotiated the partition of Indochina into 4 fully sovereign states in 1954, splitting Vietnam in 2. The North in Ho's control and the South in Bao's control. The Soviet Union had already sent advisors to North Vietnam. China and North Korea would later do the same, rendering this partition the opening salvo in a proxy of the Cold War. The small number of communist forces in South Vietnam mostly withdrew, but Ho claimed it was one country and at least gave verbal support to an initially minuscule insurgency there while purging his own country of hundreds of thousands of dissidents, as is so common with consolidating power after communist revolutions. American propaganda began to support South Vietnam as a bastion of freedom from these killings, despite Bao being complicit in so much colonial oppression. The U.S. Navy even created Operation Passage to Freedom, which transported over 300,000 people from North to South Vietnam, which accidentally prevented an anti-communist insurgency in the North. Then in a referendum set up and likely rigged by Bao's Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam voted to form a republic with him as the president. Much like Ho, Diem waged a massive purge in the name of anti-insurgency, though there was of course an actual insurgency to fight. Americans largely viewed Diem's fight as legitimate executions and defensive warfare. As insurgency increased, Ike sent a post-World War II American organization called the Military Assistance Advisory Group. MAAG, for short, was largely meant to advise and help direct munitions, not to engage in direct warfare.
The Vietnamese, with American advice and equipment, maintain a well-trained, well-equipped conventional force while dealing with the immediate problem of the elusive jungle-based guerrilla.
Nonetheless, a few advisors would become casualties in this interbellum period. While an insurgency existed, it was mostly grassroots, rather than direct North Vietnamese support, but that changed in 1959. Old Viet Minh insurgents started clandestine movements southward through Laos and Cambodia along what would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By 1960, they had enough rural support to launch a large-scale insurgency called the Viet Cong, as in communist guerrillas, in South Vietnam. Newly inaugurated President Kennedy sent 400 troops to directly help. These were U.S. Army Special Forces, famous for their Green Berets. They were still under MAAG command, but authorized to engage in direct combat. The U.S. Air Force also began experimenting with herbicides meant to deforest the jungles and ruin crops used by the Viet Cong. This included the infamous Agent Orange. Kennedy was already experimenting with the key elements of the Vietnam War in 1961 when he met with Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna to discuss escalating tensions following the Bay of Pigs failure and Berlin crisis. They agreed to make neighboring Laos a neutral country after years of Laos waging a proxy war between the superpowers, and they signed that agreement in Geneva in 1962. That year, Kennedy escalated U.S. involvement significantly as he chose to prioritize South Vietnam as an anti-communist bastion after the agreement. The U.S. military created the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, or MACV, which would control U.S. forces during the Vietnam War. More Green Berets arrived and Agent Orange usage escalated, just as Congress authorized the Foreign Assistance Act, allowing Kennedy to continue sending people and munitions.
The Secretary goes on to announce that there is to be a buildup of American ground combat forces in South Vietnam to help overcome the unfavorable manpower balance.
This was the first official American intervention into the Vietnam War. Contrary to popular belief, while JFK spoke about wanting to de-escalate that involvement, he made absolutely no attempt to do so.
It would be our hope to lessen the number of Americans there by 1,000 as the training intensifies and is carried on in South Vietnam. And so on, we're going to have increased airlift capacity over the next 2 or 3 years, so naturally our force will be more mobile.
That was pure aspiration. In Vietnam, President Diem was a Catholic and happily antagonized the Buddhist majority, leading people to support the Viet Cong. Protests began in 1963, including one monk lighting himself on fire in response to the Vietnamese army killing 9 unarmed civilians. As the crisis worsened, Kennedy spoke out against the Diem government, leading to the CIA backing a coup. Diem and several others were summarily executed. This severely weakened South Vietnam. Later that same month, an assassin took out JFK himself, but his successor, LBJ, would be just as dogged in getting the USA further entrenched, almost as if he were attempting to live up to his fallen predecessor's vision.
We have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise.
LBJ got a perfect opportunity to do so the following year. South Vietnam had been sending spies into the north to scout out Viet Cong support and destroy facilities that might lend aid. It was essentially a border war. In support, the US Navy had been sending ships near North Vietnam's territorial waters to collect intelligence, though not crossing the international line. North Vietnam sent their own torpedo boats to menace the USS Maddox. The Maddox fired a warning shot, which was sufficient for the patrol boats to shoot back. It was a very minor skirmish with 4 dead North Vietnamese and barely any damage to the Maddox and a singular F-8 fighter. After another destroyer joined the mission, a false radar positive made them believe that they were under attack. These 2 minor events combined into what was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was in reality fairly unremarkable. In the hands of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, it was a significant attack by an aggressive communist nation, hell-bent on spreading the ideology, and an unforgivable assault on American sovereignty in international waters. With that information, LBJ broadcast in a speech to the American people,
This new act of aggression, aimed directly at our own forces, again brings home to all of us in the United States the importance of the struggle for peace and security in Southeast Asia. Aggression by terror against the peaceful villagers of South Vietnam has now been joined by open aggression on the high seas against the United States of America. The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. It is a solemn responsibility to have to order even limited military action by forces whose overall strength is as vast and as awesome as those of the United States of America. But it is my considered conviction, shared throughout your government, that firmness in the right is indispensable today for peace. That firmness will always be measured. Its mission is peace.
Sure enough, Congress passed a bill in only a week with very little resistance. The Tonkin resolution essentially gave LBJ a blank check to intervene into the war and support South Vietnam. He wasted no time in mobilizing troops and gathering a coalition. The first 3,500 Marines arrived in half a year. Just after they arrived, Americans began to protest the war. Peacetime conscription was ongoing from 1948, so more troops meant more draftees, hence the instant opposition. These protests would become a driving factor in the 1960s counterculture. U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War continued to escalate for years, reaching its pinnacle in the last year of LBJ's presidency in 1968, dragging down his legacy and becoming the driving issue in American politics. The United States had inadvertently replaced France as the imperial power, and the war seemed to go on without end, becoming a protracted quagmire, spiraling into numerous tragedies and further civil wars in Cambodia and Laos as well. It only ended with an attempt at Vietnamization of the conflict, while coalition troops gradually removed themselves. In 1973, the sides came together in Paris and agreed to stop fighting. This was obviously a regroup for Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, while Americans fully withdrew, hence why the US Congress did not ratify the treaty. In spring of '75, North Vietnam invaded the South and easily conquered the faltering state. The Ford administration refused to intervene again, simply making a mass evacuation plan. So starting with the 1955 founding of South Vietnam to its fall, over 58,000 Americans died after hundreds of thousands more were wounded, missing, or captured. Over 1 million communists and 300,000 South Vietnamese military died, along with 3 or 4 times that in wounded, missing, or captured. Another 500,000 to 2 million civilians died in all of this. All that carnage, and for what? To stop the communists? All to have them win anyways? Veterans of all sides have to bear the weight of their memory, but it is important to keep in mind that they are not the casus belli, and it is distinctly bigoted to discriminate against them when they serve their countries well. The decisions of leaders, numerous leaders from numerous countries, chose it. No moralizing about this is sufficient. Anti-imperialism versus anti-communism is reductive nonsense, unworthy of millions dead caused by those very delusions. We must grow beyond good and evil in these conversations. Maturity requires understanding the past in its breathtaking complexity. In a non-Cold War context, we would simply call this an intervention into the Second Indochina War or Vietnamese Civil War. But the idea that Americans were over there to halt the fall of another domino to communism was a powerful misconception. The war created a crisis alongside several other issues, leading to a massive change in American culture, politics, and society. Yet the causes are difficult to understand. Even having gone through the events here, there just isn't a clear unifying justification for American involvement.
And we just cannot now dishonor our word, or abandon our commitment, or leave those who believed us and who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow. This then, my fellow Americans, is why we're in Vietnam.
Unlike Korea, where there was a full-scale invasion of a sovereign ally, this was an insurgency, hence why American troops didn't invade North Vietnam. The attitude from Truman to LBJ of in for a penny, in for a pound, kept escalating US involvement. While anti-communism gave them justification, the fact of involvement itself, as in supporting our allies and whatnot, was cause enough. The mission began as simply giving materials to a side we favored,
Here was a government on our side.
one in which didn't exist only a few years later. Our allies weren't worthy of our efforts. It turned into a proxy war with advisors. As the insurgency in South Vietnam escalated, so did American involvement, until the USA was leading the entire conflict. We expended all that blood and treasure, fighting a horrific war, all because the mission had crept out of control. We should take heed of the camel's nose parable, for we were the camel, starting with our nose under the tent, and ending all the way inside.
Thanks to my patrons on Patreon and MyHeritage for sponsoring this episode. Don't forget to check out MyHeritage at the link below for a free 2-week trial. Sinking 1, 2, 3. Really, King? Already have to deal with a cat. Hi. Oh, thank you. Somebody just wanted to be pet. Yeah. Hey, Cypher here. King literally just attacked my feet. Hi there. What are you doing down there? Hey, Cypher here. God damn it, cat.